It's 12 and it's time to get started. So good morning, everyone, and great pleasure to welcome you to this webinar on the European climate law. My name is Kati Kulovesi, and I'm Professor of International Law and Director of the Center for Climate Change, Energy and Environmental Law at the Law School of the University of Eastern Finland. And this webinar is part of a series of events that marks the end of our Jean Monnet network, GOVTRAN. GOVTRAN being short from the name Governing the EU's Climate and Energy Transition in Turbulent Times. And the GOVTRAN project is led by the Free University of Brussels with participation by the University of East Anglia, Ghent University, and us at the University of Eastern Finland. And during this project, we've published special issues on EU climate law and policy. We've organized a series of events of this, and this final conference series is part of those. We've organized a mood, and we've also published various blogs and podcasts and policy briefs. And our project has essentially sought to examine the EU climate and energy policy against the background of broader geopolitical shifts and with the view to bridging academic and policy discussions. And we are now nearing the end of our webinar series. We'll have still one keynote address, and this webinar is the second last one. And I just want to emphasize that this one and the other recordings will be available through the GOVTRAN website. So if you missed some of the previous webinars, you're most welcome to view them online. So today in this webinar, our focus will be on the European climate law. And this is the most recent addition to the EU's legal framework for addressing climate change. And the law was agreed in April and it was adopted in the summer. Formally, it's a regulation. So the title is Regulation Establishing the Framework for Achieving Climate Neutrality, but it's commonly known as the European Climate Law. The European Climate Law is a central element in the European Green Deal, where the main objective for this was to enshrine in legislation the EU's goal of being climate neutral by 2050, which the law now has done. And in addition, it also enshrined in law the EU's goal of reducing greenhouse gas emissions by at least 55% from 1990 levels by 2030. So in that sense, of course, it's important that now we have legally binding emission targets in EU legislation. But during the discussions on the climate law between the Commission, the Parliament and the Council, various issues emerged in the negotiations. One of them being ambition, whether the 2050 climate neutrality target and especially the 2030 targets are in line with climate science and the Paris Agreement's goals, whether the 2050 target should be binding at the member state level as well, and how the signposts between 2030, 2050 should be designed and so on. And also various other issues were discussed during the negotiations, including the establishment of an independent scientific advisory body, and adaptation, access to justice, and so on. So now that we have the law and it's in force, we have an excellent opportunity to assess it. What value does it add to the EU's climate law and policy framework? Are there some important gaps and shortcomings that we should be aware of and perhaps try to address them in the future? We have an excellent panel with us today to discuss the climate law. We will first have interventions from each panelist, but we are very much encouraging you to also interact with them. And I'll just now go through some of the housekeeping rules and issues to explain how this works. So you will not be able to turn on your camera or microphone, and the chat also has been disabled, but we are asking instead that you use the Q&A box to pose your questions, and you are free to do this throughout the webinar. And after we've heard from the panelists, I will take up some questions from the Q&A box and put them to the panelists. So I hope that this is all clear, and I should also state that the meeting is being recorded. So I guess that with that, we are sort of all set with the background and rules, and can start with the substantive discussions on the European climate law. And it's with great pleasure that I give the floor first to our first speaker. So Michael Bloss is a member of the European Parliament for the Green Party, European Free Alliance, and he's been very closely involved in the preparations for the European climate law, so is in a very good position to give us his assessment of the outcome and how it looks. So please, you have the floor.
Thank you, Kati, and hello, everyone. Really nice to discuss with you about the climate law, which is basically my first baby on legislative level. I have been elected in 2019 as a climate activist, as really someone who cares for the climate, having been to many COPs, so this UNFCCC conferences, and there was a green wave, and Fridays for Future was on the streets everywhere in Europe. And then we wanted to really do something for the climate. And then the climate law, well, there was first the announcement from Ursula von der Leyen, the Commission President, to have a Green Deal and to become climate neutral by the end or by mid of the century. And then the climate law should really put that in practice and make it a law. And I was privileged to work on this as the responsible person from the Greens. You know, every party, every political group has one responsible person. I was one from the Greens to work on it for over a year. And it was really a great experience. And I think we could achieve something, even though not everything. So I'm not fully content with the outcome. And what was our main idea? First, it was to really be in line actually with the 1.5 degree goal and with Paris. That was one of the main ideas. And the second was that this idea of listening to science, that this was being brought closer to the whole policy-making processes. And let's see whether we achieved this. So that was the ideas. The pathway is that first, as you probably know, in order to make a law on the European level, the Commission is proposing something, and then in the European Parliament it's being discussed and amended, and in the Council, so member states, they also discuss and amend it, and then we have basically two different versions of this law, and then in trialogues you have to get this to one version that gets the support of both houses, so of the Parliament and of the Council in majority. So that was the difficult process on the European level. And on the ambition level, as was already said, so one thing was to really achieve climate neutrality by the year 2050. But the year of achieving climate neutrality has not a lot to do with actually the possibility of staying within 1.5 degrees or well below 2 degrees, because this is not the year when you become climate neutral. It's more like the amount of tons of CO2 that you emit until this moment. So we wanted to have a much more ambitious goal. Our goal was to actually focus on the year 2030. So what happens in 10 years' time, because it's always nice for politicians to talk about what happens in 30 years' time, but 10 years then becomes much more practical. And here was the proposal of the Commission to have this ambition level of 55% net emission reduction. And we wanted to go for a 65% gross emission reduction. What's the difference? Well, the Commission changed the way how the climate goals are calculated. They shifted from gross to net. In net, there's also the things included. So 55% in net actually is a 52.8% target in gross. And we were not happy with 52.8%, by the way. The other things was introducing new things that bring us close to science. One is, as it was already mentioned, we wanted to have a scientific panel that gives advice to policymakers, that puts up reports every year to the Commission, to the Council, to us in the Parliament, whether we are on track with on achieving the goals of the Paris Agreement. And these scientific councils, they have been established in many member states of the European Union already, and they have proven to be very successful there. So that's why we really wanted to have it on the European level. And secondly, we had the idea of introducing a CO2 budget. So not calculating our per year targets 55% by 2030 or so, but like saying this is the amount of CO2 that we have still left. We derive it from the IPCC reports, and then and this is what can be then implemented in European legislation, for instance, through the emission trading system, which is actually a CO2 budget, and the effort sharing regulation, which is also a CO2 budget. So that was one the ideas of how to bring it close to science. In the end, we succeeded in getting the council, the scientific council, into the law, which will be now a new institution that should be set up in the year 2022. And for the CO2 budget, we, well, did not fully succeed. In the year 2023, the European Commission has to publish a CO2 budget for the European Union for the years 2030 till 2050. It's not well, and it's not a binding CO2 budget, but at least we are switching the idea, or the, how to say, the modes of how to discuss on climate, going away from only this percentage target, but actually talking about CO2 budget, and then also getting into interesting debates. How much CO2 budget can we consume in the European Union, and what does it mean for international justice ideas? And so how much, for instance, do we need to transfer to the rest of the world or to countries of the global south in order for us to stay actually within our CO2 budget? So that's good. On the ambition level, where we arrived at, is actually this what the European Commission proposed in the very first place, which is this minus 55 net target and a 2050 climate neutrality, only binding for the European Union, not on member state level. And that's what I'm really not so content with, because looking to science and, for instance, the climate action tracker, they are they believe that this new European target is insufficient in meeting the Paris Agreement goals, because it is getting us to a global warming between 2 and 3 degrees and not well below 2 degrees. And I believe that at least as the European Union, calling ourselves a climate champion, and also having somehow, well, we need to be leaders in order for the rest of the world to follow. Having an insufficient climate target is not really what we can achieve right now in this very important years where we can still kind of condemn the climate crisis. So this was also the reasons why we Greens voted against the climate law at the end, because voting on something in the year 2021 that is not compatible with the Paris Agreement is just not acceptable for us. There were other interesting debates that we were pushing into the law. For instance, the question of when to end fossil subsidies, that the European Parliament had a majority position that we want to end it by 2025. The access to justice, so like going into the direction of establishing some right to a healthy climate by, for instance, giving individuals subjectivity to the law and the possibility to go in front of the court to claim their rights to be involved into all of the decision-making processes. All of this we were not able to achieve something, but at least we put it on the table. And this week we are voting, for instance, on the Aarhus Convention regulation, where parts of it was taken on board. But the interesting thing, of course, is also how does it continue from here? It's unfortunate that I just learned that you will stop your GOVTRAN project now, because I think now it becomes really interesting. Now we have basically the legal framework and the architecture, but the proof of the pudding is in the eating. And now we go into implementation and see actually what if this will help us to have more ambitious kind of instruments. And this was presented, well, the first ideas for the instrument was presented on the 14th of July by the Commission, the so-called Fit for 55 package, which are 15, I think, different laws that should get us to achieving these new climate targets. And this ranges really from a revision of the emission trading system, the ETS, which covers 40% of European emissions, but also the Renewable Energy Directive, the Energy Efficiency Directive, the alternative fuels infrastructure, which says, you know, how many charging points should be on the streets in Europe. The question that from what date only emission-free cars can be licensed to new to our streets. The Commission proposes 2035. So all of these different aspects of then actually really not only speaking about targets and where we want to go, but then really speaking about the concrete reduction of emissions. This is now what we will be dealing with in the next 2 years, I guess, maybe more. And I hope that the climate law gave us a little bit of a better framework. At least one important rule I think we have to establish, which is this one in, one out. You cannot reduce the ambition in one sector without saying where you want to increase the ambition in another, because now you have the law that is the targets that are enshrined into law, and we have to achieve them, even though they are not yet sufficient. I hope we can even overachieve them. Actually, I have a lot of ideas what we can do in order to overachieve them. But unfortunately, this is not the topic of this panel, which we should possibly have another panel on how to actually overachieve our targets and stay within the Paris Agreement targets. But having said this, I hope I gave you a little bit of an idea what this climate law on Europe is all about. It's basically kind of the legal framework for what the Green Deal should achieve, but now really come to the climate action in the next 2 years, and then we actually see whether we will be able to do so, whether we will be faster or not. I think a lot of this also decides on is decided in hopefully the next German government, whether they will be in the forefront of the climate policies in Europe or not. I had a lot of more interesting and nice anecdotes to tell about how this whole negotiations were happening and what we discussed at 4 o'clock in the morning when finally kind of this final deal was sealed. But maybe that's for the questions. And for now, I thank you for the invitation and look forward to the debate with you.
Thank you very much. That was an excellent overview of the climate law and also the background and motivation. And indeed, I agree that this is, of course, now the beginning, and the work will have to continue. And there definitely will be other opportunities to also discuss the Fit for 55 and the implementation of the climate law. So our work also will not stop completely with the GOVTRAN project. We have already one running led by Matthias and his colleagues at Ecologic Institute. So definitely we'll remain engaged with this topic. But now we can continue still today focusing on the European climate law and what it has brought to the EU climate law and policy framework. So our next panelist is Head of Climate at Ecologic, Matthias Duvet. And he's recently done excellent work in analyzing the European climate law, also national framework laws on climate change in various EU member states, and the EU climate governance system in general. So he's in an excellent position to share us his views on the EU climate law and how it looks from that perspective. So please, Matthias.
Thank you very much, Kati, for having me and for the kind introduction. It's a real pleasure to have the opportunity to speak with you all about the EU climate law here today. Indeed, I'm doing this from the perspective of somebody who's been analyzing national governance systems and climate framework laws, because we've had other colleagues, such as my dear Dr. Niels Meyer-Ohlendorf, who has been following the negotiations in particular detail. But that is why I am going to try and answer two questions in my intervention. Here is an input to the conversation. The first one is, how does the EU climate law impact member states and their governance systems? And then the second one is, how does what's in the EU climate law compare to what member states have put into their national climate framework laws? And I am indeed doing that on the basis of analysis that is published, even if not peer-reviewed, but available online. It's analysis that we've done on the one hand for the European Environment Agency with the dear colleagues at IDRI in France, and then work that we've done for the European Climate Foundation. And there was an update to that report earlier this year. So if you're looking for more information on national governance systems or national climate framework laws, feel free to check those out. So on to that first question. What does the EU climate law do for member states? I want to frame that with a little bit of background. This is from the EEA report I just referenced, that if you're trying to map where climate governance systems are in Europe at the national level, you're getting a quite diverse picture. There are some member states that have very detailed, elaborate systems that are based on climate laws, even that specify a lot of details in terms of processes, responsibilities, regular cycles for policies and for planning and for transparency, for example. And then there are those that have less detail, and some of them, which we've categorized here as the ones that are basically just doing what the baseline is that is prescribed by international obligations under the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change and introduced through EU legislation, which sets a foundation for national climate governance systems that every EU member states must put in place. That includes things like national energy and climate plans, or the obligation to produce national long-term strategies. There is annual data reporting, etc. And so EU legislation, one can say, and the UN system have actually provided a minimum standard for governance systems already. But you can see that a number of member states have gone beyond that to define their own systems in more detail. Now, what does the EU climate law add to that? This may look a little mechanistical since I've been going through the articles, but they are not all in their original order for a reason, but they are also in that order in the law for a reason. There's a certain logic to that, which is first looking at the targets. And this is where for the EU, as was said in the introduction, this is a major innovation, having these targets. The targets are increased, but having them binding in law. But the impact on member states is, the direct impact is relatively limited, because, as was stated already, the notion that all member states would actually have to introduce this law and it would be becoming binding individually for every one of them was rejected in the negotiations. So we have here a collective responsibility by all member states towards the target. So there isn't a direct way in which the law changes what member states have to adopt as their own national long-term goals. The same is true for the interim target for 2030 and for the process for the 2040 target setting. Of course, that's immediately relevant to member states, but it doesn't include specific obligations for member states, or doesn't prescribe what member states would have as their own target. That is the subject of a legislation such as the change of the climate action regulation that's ongoing as part of the Fit for 55 package. The big addition or innovation mentioned, the advisory board, I will completely defer to Alina's input on that and just say that it could engage in things relevant to member states, but the law doesn't really specify. The first point where there is a direct new obligation on member states is in Article 5, where national adaptation strategies are now a mandatory thing for all member states. Having said which, most EU member states already, I think essentially all, if I'm not mistaken, actually do already have a national adaptation plan or strategy. So this is an important addition. Adaptation is actually featured quite regularly side by side with the emission reduction obligations. That's an important thing as such, this integration of mitigation and adaptation. And so having that is important. And here is the first direct obligation that changes things for member states potentially. I'm going to jump to the next point and not speak about the EU level changes, but there's one other article that directly introduces new obligations for member states, Article 7. It's actually called, I think, Assessment of National Measures, but I'm reframing it or rephrasing it here as it's basically a consistency check of national policies and measures. It's every 5 years the Commission has the mandate to go and take all of the reporting by member states on their climate policy, such as reporting on national energy climate plans, and do an assessment to check whether that's in line with the EU achieving its climate neutrality goal. And where that assessment shows, you over there, your policy on certain type of fossil fuel infrastructure, for example, isn't really helping us achieve that goal, is in direct contradiction. The Commission is in a position to then issue recommendations to which the member state in question has to respond to. That is, that's not a very strong threat. It's not a very big stick that the Commission has there to get member states to change. But this assessment alone, creates transparency. It could create publicity around the fact that there is an indication that something is not consistent with that goal. There are some other minor changes to public participation provisions and some interesting small changes to the reporting and planning documents, but those don't really, there aren't big changes. So in sum, I would say, if you compare it to the governance regulation that was adopted in 2019, my apologies. The EU climate law's impact on member states isn't so much in that it adds to, that minimum standard of governance provisions that all member states need to have or put in place. There isn't a direct enhancement except for these two specific changes that I mentioned. However, I think there is another impact here that results from the fact that we now have climate neutrality as a binding target for the EU as a whole. It's a long-term goal, but it's substantiated through the interim targets that have also been increased. And so there's a much stronger spirit and actual legal bindingness for putting the EU on a long-term path towards net zero. And that surely must strengthen also climate policy making that's going in that direction in member states. One thing that's a bit of a partially pet peeve thing of mine is this climate progress measuring that the EU is going to do. That is something new. I'll speak about it again in a second. And here, this could impact and support member states if the EU actually comes forward and the Commission develops a system for tracking, underlying change towards climate neutrality. I'm moving on to my second question, and I'll be a little bit quicker on that one. How does the EU climate law compare to national climate framework laws? And I think important to remember that there is now a majority of EU member states that either already have a national climate framework law or are preparing one. There are live discussions, for example, in Portugal. The map here is slightly out of date because the Spanish law has been adopted in the meantime. So there is really a strong proliferation of such framework laws. And we've had a couple of examples of things where the EU climate law takes a sheet from from those other laws. Just to say what I'm going to check for, there are certain key elements that our analysis has shown that are included in such national climate framework laws. And I'm going to quickly check on those to see what's in the EU climate law and how it compares. And with regards to targets, there one can say that this is what where the climate law makes a big step forward, and that's really in line with good practice in member states. Having a long-term target binding, having interim targets included, a process for setting new targets, and the budget approach. That's all boxes ticked in terms of good practice picked up. The planning dimension is not really applicable here because it's dealt with in the governance regulation, but there was a chance to make the updating to the EU long-term strategy mandatory for the Commission, which currently it isn't, and that was not done. So that's where some of the national laws have more regular cycles. With regard to the policies, it's also slightly a different story because that is very much dealt with in the governance regulation with national energy and climate plans. But for the EU level, actually, there are now these new consistency checks and the potential to propose new measures if the progress measuring shows the EU is not on track. So here, that's I think a significant innovation, and that is in line with member states that have basically policy cycles that check and whether they're on track and triggering new policy. On the monitoring, I just mentioned, this thing that I'm particularly looking at. This is an innovation to member states' practice. Member states' climate laws that we have analyzed do not have a dedicated process for checking specifically towards progress towards net zero. They're checking progress towards more short-term targets. I'm going to end this relatively quickly. On the scientific advice, you already heard member states have a lot of those bodies. I'm not going to say anything more about it. On public participation, sadly, there's a dedicated article, but actually very little in substance in the law. But that is sadly in line with several national climate framework laws, which also really don't have dedicated provisions for public participation engagement on climate policy specifically. We haven't done analysis on why that is. What one can say is that member states do actually experiment with citizen assemblies, for example. And so there is some movement here, and hopefully that can be replicated at the EU level. And I think I'm going to stop there to leave more room for Alina and for the discussion afterwards. And I thank you for your attention.
And thank you very much, Matthias. I think it was a very interesting analysis on how the EU climate law has affected or is going to affect climate governance in the member states, and also a very useful comparison with the national framework laws on climate change that are in place in the various member states. Now, the next topic is going to be focusing on the scientific advisory body. So as we've heard, that this is one of the main new elements that the European climate law has brought to the EU climate governance system. And our speaker is Dr. Alina Avershenkova. She's Distinguished Policy Fellow and Lead on Governance and Legislation at the Grantham Institute at the London School of Economics and Political Science. And she's been involved in the discussion, explaining the benefits and design options for a scientific advisory body, independent scientific advisory body in the EU climate law, including through an excellent report. So I'm very much looking forward to hearing her views on the new European Scientific Advisory Board. So please, Alina, floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Kati, for this kind introduction. Good morning, everyone. It's a great pleasure to be part of this debate today. So in the next 15 minutes or so, I'd like to focus on discussing why this is a really important element, the independent expert advice and the advisory board that the climate law has created. Then how does this compare to the best practice that we see so far with independent advisory bodies, specifically looking at the UK Climate Change Committee, which has been a prototype for many of such bodies internationally. And finally, review the provisions and discuss some challenges ahead. So why do we focus so much on this element, and why is it really important that the European climate law has the independent advisory body? This was actually quite a contentious point in negotiations, and I'm sure Michael, in his anecdotes, once we go to the panel discussion, can probably tell us many stories on how they actually managed finally to get this into the law, which I think was a great win for the Greens and for the European Parliament overall. But why is it important? I think we all realize that successful transition to climate neutrality in the European Union will require political buy-in at the national level, among the different groups at the European level, and would really require public support, both for the objectives of the law, but also for the underlying policies which will be put in place to meet them. And the experience internationally shows that having an independent expert advisory body, which is detached from politics, does not represent the views of specific organizations or political parties, is a great tool to enhance legitimacy and accountability of climate policy making. And it really helps to strengthen public trust and support for climate action. And therefore, the proposal was really put forward by a number of players in the course of negotiations of the European climate law to create such a body, which would look as part of its mandate, would have review of targets, of policy proposals, but also have a role in the review of progress with implementation of the law and provide a really pan-European perspective on progress. And we really felt that failure to create such a body would expose the law to undue political pressures and potentially create scope for questioning assumptions on which policies are being built, and also validity of proposed policies. And Matthias mentioned he and his colleagues published an excellent report earlier this year, which looked at the experience of different member states. And that report actually shows that independent advisory bodies have played important roles as watchdog of the implementation of climate laws, also as reliable information provider and as a convener of key debates on the legislation. I want to focus now a little bit on the past experiences. And as I mentioned, the model of independent expert advice builds really on the UK's experience with the Climate Change Act, which in 2008 was the first comprehensive legislation on climate change at the national level. And the UK Climate Change Act established the Committee on Climate Change, which is composed of independent experts serving in their personal capacity. And their mandate, their function is firstly to recommend carbon budgets, a specific level of targets under the UK Climate Change Act. And that recommendation then goes to the government, which either accepts it and then forwards it to Parliament, or could potentially disagree with it, which hasn't happened yet in the UK's over 10 years history of Climate Change Act. The second function that the Climate Change Committee has is to monitor progress on emission reductions under the climate change law, and also progress with climate resilience. And the committee is actually tasked under the legislation with conducting their own independent review of progress. And this is a very important difference with what we have in the climate change law, the European climate change law, and I'll come to that in a minute. And at the London School of Economics at the Grantham Research Institute, we have conducted a study looking at the 10 years of parliamentary debates on climate change and interviewing key policymakers and civil society actors in private sector, which were involved in 10 years of climate policymaking in the UK after the Act was adopted. And what we found through the study is that Climate Change Committee, this independent advisory body, was really key to ensure long-term consistency in the approach to climate change policy across different government departments in the UK, and also has been a key driver for transparency and legitimacy of the process, and really ensured more informed decision-making in the UK. So just a couple of words on the composition of the body in the UK, because I think this is critical. I'll tell you in a minute that the call for applications for experts to the European Advisory Board is actually open. And I think now the composition of expertise is one of the key debates we're going to have to face as applications start coming in. So the UK Committee on Climate Change actually has moved away from having purely climate scientists, like, scientists with natural sciences background. It is quite diverse. It has experts with expertise in economics and specific sectors such as food and agriculture and behavioral sciences, and in technology and engineering. And they come with experience in different sectors, not just academia, but also politics, third sector, and business in the past. But in their role, they act in their personal capacity. And what I wanted to highlight about that experience of the Climate Change Committee, basically what we have in the UK is a purely technocratic committee, non-political, supported by a strong secretariat and chaired by a high-profile chair, Lord Dibben. He's very engaged in the climate change discussions in different forums in the UK. And he's obviously a member of the House of Lords. However, in his role as the chair, again, he acts in his personal independent capacity, not representing his political party or any other organization. What we've noticed, having analyzed 10 years of parliamentary debates in the UK, is that the information of Climate Change Committee, the information that they produced, has really integrated into the discussions, not only on climate change itself, not only on carbon budgets and on progress with implementation of climate law, but actually into most of the sectoral debates which are critical for climate policy. So here I'm showing you you can see that over 40% of all of the sittings in the UK Parliament over the past 10 years that focused on energy bill, for example, they would have had information from Climate Change Committee cited by the members of Parliament who took the floor in those debates, which is quite remarkable. Same applies, to water bill discussions, to infrastructure and housing bill. And this is what we want to see. We want climate policy not to be an isolated matter, but actually to penetrate all of the discussions. And the independent advisory body in the UK actually played a critical role to ensuring that that actually happens. And what we've heard from the interviews that we conducted, that the key to that was their political independence and high rigor, analytical rigor and expertise that the committee presents. And here is citations by the different political parties. So citations of the information produced by the Climate Change Committee. So basically, it's not just Greens, it's everyone. That is a really interesting conclusion. So it's really across the political spectrum, politicians have engaged with information produced by Climate Change Committee. So it really became this non-partisan accepted source of information. And this is what we want to achieve with the European Advisory Board, Scientific Advisory Board on Climate Change. We want it to be a trusted, independent, highly regarded body for the independent scientific expertise. Now, how do we get there? Well, I think we have a really good start, thanks to efforts of Michael and his colleagues to a large extent, that this body actually is part of the European climate law. I think it's very important. And here are some of the key functions that are mentioned both in the preamble to the legislation and the legislation itself. So basically, all of the kind of fundamental principles are mentioned in the law. So the board should be functional. It should provide scientific expertise based on best available up-to-date evidence that is factual and transparent, and that evidence should underpin the EU's climate action and efforts to reach climate neutrality. They highlight the independence and the expertise of the board members, and the decision was taken that the advisory board will complement the work of the European Environmental Agency, yet act independently. And an important point highlighted is that it should avoid overlap with IPCC, which was surprisingly quite a contentious issue leading up to the discussions of the board. So I'll just say a couple of words on that to clarify potential doubts that might be there. And finally, again, very important, it is envisioned that the board will have a budget, a dedicated budget, which is great, and that that budget should be factored into the budget of the European Environmental Agency. So just one thought on the IPCC, again, maybe that goes to the anecdote session afterwards, but for some reason, there was quite a lot of concern in the leading up to the negotiations of the board that this will somehow undermine or overlap with IPCC. And I just wanted to highlight that the mandate of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change is really to provide policymakers with scientific assessment on climate change and potential and future risks and options for adaptation and mitigation. And they really aim to determine the state of knowledge overall and identify the areas of agreement in the scientific community. What IPCC does not do is provide advice on specific targets, specific policy proposals. Neither does it assess progress in the implementation of climate policy in a specific geography. And that is the function of independent advisory bodies such as the European Advisory Board for the European Union. So I think we shouldn't be really concerned about overlaps with IPCC, but it's great that the law mentions it as a principle. Now, here are some provisions of Article 3, which really focuses on the mandate for the advisory board. And here I have to say that, again, we have the basics in the law, but my main personal concern is that it is still quite general. If we compare it to the UK Climate Change Act, the mandate of the Climate Change Committee is much more specific. It actually tells, well, you know, the committee has to prepare annual report on progress with implementation of the legislation. It has to put proposal for the carbon budgets. The wording in the European climate law is a bit softer. So I think now we're entering a really crucial period where the members of the advisory board will be selected and they would have to put forward their working program. And I think they will have a little bit more challenge than the UK Climate Change Committee had in making their outputs, you know, really make a difference in the policy process. Because one important provision the UK Climate Change Act had, it actually obliges the UK government to consider the advice of the Climate Change Committee and to respond to it. So if they disagree, the UK government, with the UK Climate Change Committee, they have to say, you know, what they disagree on and why. In the European climate law, we don't see such a provision, and that, you know, puts an onus much more on the members of the advisory board on climate change to actually push for their outputs and for their recommendations to be taken up seriously. So that's one challenge I see going forward. But just to summarize real quick, the key tasks of the advisory board based on the law are to provide, to consider the latest scientific findings, of course, and to translate that information to the relevance of the European Union. Specifically, it should provide scientific advice and reports on existing and proposed union measures, climate targets, and indicative greenhouse gas budgets, and also assess and advise on their coherence with the objectives of European climate law and with the international commitments. They're also tasked with contributing to the exchange of independent scientific knowledge in specific fields of modeling, monitoring, and promising research and innovation, identify action and opportunities needed to successfully achieve the Union's climate target. That's very important. That potentially provides them a route to be proactive, not just commenting and assessing what is being, you know, put forward by the European Commission and other actors, but actually come with their own initiatives if they see the gaps. And finally, raising awareness on climate change and its impacts, as well as stimulating dialogue and cooperation with the scientific advisory bodies in Europe. So I've done a quick kind of scan through the law to see where and which articles specific input of the advisory boards are mentioned. And these are the key 4 blocks of relevant policy processes where European Commission and other actors have to draw on advice of the board. So firstly, in the report on the projective indicative budgets for 2030-2050. And again, the language is that it needs to take the advice of the board into account. In the proposal for 2040 climate target, specifically, the law mentions that that should take into account reports by the board. The assessments of unions' progress and measures under Article 6, and also assessments of consistency of national implementation under Article 7. And finally, the reports by the board should be taken by the European Commission, should be taken into account when it prepares the reports, regular reports to the European Parliament and to the Council, leading up to each of the global stocktake under the Paris Agreement. So I think we have a key hooks to all of the key European processes. The challenge will be identifying exactly, what the board needs to produce, by when, and how that advice is taken into account. And so that, I think, is the challenge for the next steps. Very quickly on the composition, the board will be composed of 15 senior scientific experts, and scientific expertise is defined broadly. So it allows actually the management board, which is going to be appointing it, to ensure the balance of different expertise. No more than 2 members can come from the same member states, can be affiliated in terms of their nationality. They should be independent. The selection will be done by the management board, I'll show you in the next slide the composition of that board. And basically, they will designate the members for 4 years initially, and that could be renewed by 1 more term. Again, ensuring the balance of expertise, geographical representation, and gender balance. And members will be appointed in their own personal capacity and independently from the positions of their states and any organizations or institutions. So I think is a crucial position. What is interesting, the advisory board will select its own chair, which is different from some of the models in some countries. For example, in the UK, the chair is appointed rather than selected by the board itself. So that's an interesting model. So how do we, if we look at the best practices with independent climate change advisory bodies, how can we score or where do we see the challenges and kind of the positives in what we have in the European climate law? I think I've highlighted some of that, but I think on clear mandate, I think we have some core elements of the mandate there, but as I mentioned, there are some ambiguities in terms of exactly when and how the board would be producing inputs, and in particular on government's accountability, or in this case, accountability of EU's institutions. It's not entirely clear how, say, European Commission is expected to respond to input. It's expected to take it into account, but this may be subject to interpretation. So I think that's an area to watch. Great allocated predictable funding that is envisioned, so that's good. The high level of technical expertise, I think that criteria is fully met. Independence, parliamentary oversight, I think that's one area where, again, that potentially this area could be strengthened in the future. Again, in the UK, for example, the outputs of the independent advisory body go for consideration to Parliament. In the European climate law, that is not necessarily a requirement, but it doesn't preclude it. And I will finish with that just to draw your attention that the call for expressions of interest is out. So if you meet the profile, please do apply. It's really important that we all do if we feel that we meet the requirements. It needs to be in by 1st of November. And I've put here, so the first bullet is really the wording from the call for expressions of interest in terms of how the European Environmental Agency outlines, the key remit of the committee, which is really good. The evaluation committee is composed of 7 members, including the chair of EEA Management Board, executive director, and the chair of the scientific committee, and they will appoint another 4 members to join the selection committee. The link for the call for expression of interest is there. I think we will share the slides, afterwards, so you will all have it. So please do participate. I'll leave it here, and happy to discuss more in the next section.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Alin. I think that was a very useful overview of the new European Scientific Advisory Body on climate change, and also I think very interesting comparisons with the UK Climate Change Committee, which has already been operating for a while. So I think that those interesting materials from your research. I think overall we've gotten very useful and inspiring food for thought from the panel. And I'm very much encouraging you to use the Q&A box in order to ask questions. And I know that there already are some questions. So what we're going to do next is that we go through the panel again. So I will give the panelists also the opportunity, if you want to react or comment to anything that the other panelists have done. And at the same time, I'll also select some of the questions from the Q&A box that may be directed to you. So coming back to Michael, I see from the Q&A box that there's a lot of interest in hearing more about the negotiations on the climate law. And I have to say that it was a very interesting, I also got very interested when you referred to the 4 a.m. discussions. Those are always delicious. So there are some questions if you wanted to share some more insights from the negotiations, what were the key issues. There's a question on wanting to also hear more about lobbying behind the climate law from business and different social actors. So in addition to perhaps if you want to react to any of the other interventions that we've heard, but you can also perhaps address those questions. And if I may add, if we think about the negotiations, I think one element that we've not really touched upon in detail, but I also found interesting and perhaps a little bit missing in the climate law is the access to justice dimension. So we know, of course, that there is a very strong growth in climate litigation. We know that access to justice in these issues can be very important. So if you also wanted to shed some light on what happened there and if you're satisfied with the outcome, please, Michael.
Yeah, so I don't know yet who is all in the audience, so I want to share. It's sometimes better to share this also at 4 o'clock in the morning with some beers. But no, I think just what is, I mean, you must not underestimate the, how to say, the political pressures and dynamics that are happening around such a negotiation. Basically, we had 6 rounds of negotiations, and the main point of the parliament was that we had a position with a majority vote for minus 60% and in gross emission reduction for the year 2030. And that's quite far away from the 52.8 or 55 net. And this was our main pressure point, and we really wanted to win something on it. And basically it was always kind of the same procedure. We told this to the presidency, the Portuguese, and they came back and said, yeah, interesting, but we are not ready to negotiate, and we didn't even discuss it with our, you know, with the council. And I think then from 2 o'clock to 4 o'clock in the morning, we had a break. And we really hoped that there was now a movement in this, because everyone was waiting. That was the main topic, the ambition level. And, you know, like, people have been calling, and a lot of other people told me, oh, something is moving, don't worry. Yeah, we have the council and we have a commitment here. And then at 4 o'clock, we entered back into the negotiation room, and the council came and had this exactly same wording like the 6 meetings we had before. So there was basically nothing achieved. Yeah, that was quite frustrating. And the kind of the way out is, I don't know whether you noticed, but there was then this declaration by the Commission that they want to increase the sinks to 300 megatons by the year 2030, and that is then actually a 57% target. Whereas it is clear that normally we wanted to have this phrase written into the law so that there is actually some kind of legal substance to it. But of course, the council was not at all ready to go for this. And we, Alina, also thanks a lot for all of the support, and Matthias, that we got from you during these negotiations. But we negotiated also the climate council, or the scientific council, up until the very end. And we had to fight because the idea was always that from the member states, that they basically send their representatives to this European Scientific Climate Council. So really putting in danger the independence of this body, and all of this arguments about the IPCC and so on. Of course, it's my interpretation, but they were purely political in order to undermine the idea of such a body. And we had to really fight also in the very late up to, so that that this is basically an independent body outside of the framework of the EEA, because that was kind of the last frontier of the council. Was okay, then we just integrated into the into the EEA, but really have nothing that is somehow independent and gives direct advice. And these kind of fights we had into the end. I mean, I'm really also clearly unhappy that it's only from European member states people inside the council, because that has nothing to do with scientific reasoning. I mean, science is not based on nationality, but some of the things we were not able to push through. And also the more like a detailed description of what should be the objective, and the what should they do with. I mean, there was a lot of up until the very end discussion and fights. Let's say it like this. Well, no, but also the Commission was not really helpful in all of this. They were not necessarily the ones who you expect them to be, as those who really want to go forward and have ambitious climate targets. That was nothing that I could experience during the whole negotiations, that there was this push from this side. And on the access to justice, really, basically, that basically, we did not even really discuss it, because it took so long to discuss on ambition level, on an independent body, on the question of climate neutrality for all, and this kind of stuff. So that in the end, there was just very, very little debate, and it was taken off the climate law, unfortunately. But that was then, I think, already in the direction of 5 a.m. So that's also a negotiation tactic, when to put it on the agenda. Yeah. And the more juicy anecdotes, I hope then in person.
Excellent, Michael. Thank you very much. I think it was very enlightening already to hear this. And I also think that the sort of compromise and the ambition and the sinks and the net and cross target, I think it's always useful to explain, because it's something that's a little bit difficult to comprehend, I find, for many of my students, for example, and I think even myself. Then coming back to Matthias, I think there is also a specific, so the same terms of reference, feel free to comment and respond to any question or put forward any ideas that inspired by the other panelists. And then I think that there is at least one or two specific questions, or two specific questions to you. So one refers to your slides and the map. And the question is whether the legal actions, if you take into consideration agenda and the other climate cases in terms of compliance with commitments, would that change the map? Or is that something different? And then there is another question. So what lessons can be drawn from the EU climate law and possibly national laws in member states for other non-EU countries which are still developing their framework climate laws? And is there anything in the EU climate law on co-benefits of climate policies, for instance, for improving air quality?
Thanks to everyone for your interest and for those questions. And also, I have to say, it was a pleasure listening to Alina lay out the benefits of having such an advisory body and the potential that the current role has, and Michael's details on the negotiations. And I want to say, maybe upfront that, we obviously, what we have with the EU climate law now, we have a number of additional processes and mechanisms, plus that new body, that new institution. And all of these have a lot of potential to enhance EU climate policy making. They will create additional transparency. There's going to be more accountability by member states, by the EU as a whole. There's also as a provision to enhance, already at the level of when policies are being conceived, at the impact assessment level, to check whether there's an impact on climate neutrality. So we're seeing, a lot of scope for enhancing and mainstreaming considerations about the climate impacts into EU policymaking. We obviously don't know yet how well the delivery and the implementation is going to be. So that's why I say, in terms of potential, I think this is a double thumbs up, and it's has a lot of potential to make a big difference. And appreciation goes to everyone who was involved in making it happen and making it better and stronger. And the European Parliament obviously helped, had a very proactive attitude in the whole stance on the EU climate law, in wanting to make it more specific, and also inserting some lessons from the national level here. And I think a lot of appreciation for that. In terms of some of the specific, and I want to say I fully agree, obviously, with Alina's description and also the assessment of what we have there in terms of, again, potential. And there are hooks in all the right places for that body to do something. The word independent appears, I don't know, like 5-6 times. Is like a lot of the right pointers are there, and it will very much, I think, depend on the individuals. And I think, this overall solution found with it being hosted by the EEA, which is already, an important and neutral and relatively independent arbiter and information provider on EU climate policy and environmental policy overall. I think that's, that, makes some intuitive sense and cannot be to the detriment of that body, I think. And to the other questions, first one on the map. So the map itself was basically showing, how strong our governance systems are overall. And the ones that are most robust are the ones with national climate framework laws, except for, I think it's Lithuania that already has a pretty strong system, but actually doesn't have a law. It's the exception to the rule. But the I'm not what I would love to do, next in terms of analysis would actually be checking more where and under what circumstances do these national climate litigation cases appear, and there may be literature out this on this already. Even in my home country in Germany, we have, of course, seen court challenge, successful challenge at the level of the Constitutional Court in Germany against the National Climate Framework Law that was adopted in 2019 here. And so my sense is that the establishment of climate framework laws enhances the opportunity for citizens and stakeholders to actually go and then also demand of governments that they do things properly. The Irish case was also, basically saying, there's something procedural here that you're not doing right. So there are a number of these cases, and so the map basically wouldn't change, I think, but it gives you an indication of, the robust cases are the ones where climate litigation, I think, is more likely to appear. And for the ones where the countries that don't have such specific regulatory frameworks to organize climate governance, it's for those cases that access to justice allowed at the EU level for access to justice in national courts. I think that is crucial. And my understanding of the changes that are coming with the Aarhus regulation that Michael mentioned that the Parliament is voting on, there have been improvements for access to justice for environmental policy making, but that's one of the pieces that's missing is access to justice in national courts, so that citizens can also go and go to courts over a bad national energy and climate plan or a long-term strategy, that type of thing. So that we're still missing, but so that member states that are putting forward regulatory framework as laws, they could provide that kind of opportunity already. And that they can, the Urgenda case is an early one, an important one. A lot of these litigation cases have led to very concrete improvements. In Germany, basically politicians in an election campaign couldn't wait to basically, go and then increase our national targets within the space of like 6 weeks. It was absolutely mind-boggling. So lessons for other countries, I think that's a very good question. It's also important in that sense to point out that actually, the climate framework laws are not just proliferating in Europe. 2/3 of the OECDs have countries have such laws, Mexico actually being one of the early adopters. There are many other countries, Argentina, Guatemala, Kenya, the Philippines. So actually, climate laws exist around the world, and they're being put in place, I think, where governments realize what the added value is here, and that's like a business type attitude would be to say you're professionalizing climate policy, but you can also describe this differently. It's just enhancing your ability or government's ability to actually achieve policy goals is what you're getting if you're putting a sound framework in place. If you learn from the good practice that is out there and put in the elements that are shown to be used in several places, then you get better information, you get more stability and predictability about your processes, and you get enhanced accountability, and all of that benefits stakeholders that are having to prepare for the changes that are coming with climate policy, and it also enhances the predictability of the national process. In Germany, we're just 8 days after our national election now. The last time around, we didn't have a national climate framework law, and it wasn't quite clear. It was only EU legislation that would have forced a government to take additional action. But now, actually, whatever the future constellation of our government is going to be, there is a law that already forces them to take action. They have to put significant additional policies in place to achieve the targets that are in that law. So, there are many, I think, advantages of putting such a law in place. And I think that was already very long, so I'm going to stop here.
Okay, thanks, Matthias. Yes, I couldn't agree more. I think it's very useful and important that governments put in place national framework laws and they enshrine targets there. So I think that we have many examples of that. And of course, therefore, important that we have the EU climate law as well. Then coming back to Alina, so feel free to comment on Michael and Matthias. There is also a question in the chat concerning the UK Climate Change Committee, so which was challenged recently regarding whether its sole industry business member had compromised its objectivity of its advice on bioenergy. It was defended in terms of the expertise of the member brought to the role, but this didn't convince NGOs. So the question is what type of lessons the EU committee might draw from this experience with the UK Climate Change Committee. Please, Alina.
Thank you, Kati. If I may, perhaps I wanted to add something to the question Matthias just tackled on what national laws can learn from the European experience. I fully agree with what Matthias said. I just wanted to add one more observation. One other lesson I would say other countries could learn is that being ambitious and dreaming big really pays off. I'd say, you know, I think it will be fair to say that, say, 5 years ago, or even 3 years ago, many of us working on climate governance, you know, we knew that we need a net zero legislation in Europe, but many of us doubted that was actually achievable at the time. And in the EU, we have a key example of countries with very different economic and social circumstances, different level of kind of political support to climate action at the national level, but it was actually possible to achieve this excellent piece of legislation. And I don't know if we have time at the end, it would be interesting to hear from Michael. What are the key learnings in terms of political consolidation? How do you actually, manage to bring these different interests together? But I think for me, that would be one, like global learning from this experience. It actually can be done, and it can be done relatively quickly. It didn't take a decade. It took just a couple of years, to really get it into place. Now, coming to Tim's question about the UK Committee on Climate Change and the controversy around the committee member which came from the private sector, I think as Tim elaborated a little bit in his second comment, the Climate Change Committee actually provided quite a detailed justification and highlighted how the independence of the member was ensured. And yes, there were some critiques who still didn't accept that, while there were other actors who accepted that the independence was not compromised. However, I think this whole conflict was, this committee member was a member for 4 years, and the inquiry was triggered by a specific discussion over a decision to build a bioenergy capture and storage facility where the organization the member is affiliated with would have a direct commercial interest. And so I think, the lessons that one can learn from this is, I would say, when the European Advisory Board develops its rules of procedure, and that is one of the first tasks they would have to face once they are appointed, is to actually anticipate the situations like that, where I think we shouldn't take learning from this that, members that, experts coming from private sector background shouldn't be part of the committee. They bring a crucial and valuable expertise. And I think that is not the learning I would take from this. But the learning would be, think through a potential situation where the advisory board is discussing a decision which might be interpreted as having a potential direct benefit to the organization that the particular member is coming from. And even though they are acting in their own personal capacity and independently, perhaps they should not be part of that decision on that particular occasion. And that could be, made very transparent and publicly, documented and communicated to preempt, discussions like in the case of the UK CCC happening. So that would be my thought, but I haven't really thought it through in detail in terms of what that arrangement would be, but it's certainly an important question to consider. So thank you, Tim, for raising that. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Alina. There are still a couple of questions without very sort of direct addresses, so feel free to respond. I'm going to take them up shortly. But I was just wondering, Michael, do you want to respond to Alina's comment that she just put to you And perhaps at the same time, I will raise some of the questions that there are in the chat. I think that there are a couple of questions that both have to do with sort of the possibly missing dimensions, or whether the sort of questions whether the climate law takes into consideration the sort of justness issues. So whether it also concerns socioeconomic issues. So there is a lot of emphasis, of course, on the climate targets and whether progress has been made, but we of course know that just transition and the sort of social dimensions of climate policy are increasingly important. So I guess the sense of the questions are asking whether the climate law makes any contribution to that effect. So Michael, please, if you want.
Alina, could you formulate your question again?
So my question was, in the European climate law, we have an example of countries with very different socioeconomic backgrounds and situations, and with very different political levels of support for climate action, actually being able to come together and agree a very ambitious piece of legislation. If you can offer some learnings to other countries in terms of political consolidation, how did you manage to bridge those differences, say, in the European Parliament and beyond? Are there any learnings on how do you actually bring everyone together and get it through?
That's a very good question. And I mean, it was my first legislation, so I cannot really compare what we did here right, what maybe in other legislative processes we did wrong. Maybe the interesting thing is, don't underestimate the support, because if you look into like the tactic was basically, no, we have a very ambitious position of the parliament, and then we hope to get a lot of things through during negotiations with the council. Of course, it was very, very difficult because the heads of states, they agreed already on this language, on this net 55, and then going against heads of state was very difficult. But how did we, for instance, get to the 60% in the parliament? The half of the Polish conservative delegation voted for 60%. And so you can find support where you maybe do not expect it. So try to really use all of the different possibilities to get support for ambition, because sometimes it's there. And I guess, of course, the climate law is not, you cannot look at it only from kind of in a single view, but it is embedded into also the just transition fund that then actually channels money into also the East. But yeah, there is a lot of opportunities as well. So if you look, for instance, into Poland, also the opportunities in terms of renewable energies are immense. So stressing also that, the climate is not only like a burden that we now have to do in order to save the world for like future generations, but it is the transition that is happening now. This is happening everywhere. The US is also investing now a lot into this direction, China. So this transition has to happen, and the opportunities are there. And so we have to be fast in this. This is also, I think, something that is part of the whole equation, and it's true. It's just true, even though some political forces do not really see it. Yeah, so maybe that are some of the things. And I think, for us, it was just important to have a good team in the parliament from the different parties that work well together and align with. And sometimes it's good to compromise also in order to have a stronger common position. But I'm not sure if this is applicable to other political systems, because they're also different. And the way the European Parliament works is, of course, different to a national parliament works that has much more a group of parties that form the government coalition. And it's not so dynamic like the European Parliament, where you do not have this fixed coalitions that are forming the majority, but you can find majorities in different ways. The social economic issues, that's really one of the, I think, overall critique that we have to formulate on the whole Green Deal, the climate law and the Fit for 55 package, that we're just talking about a very fundamental transformation of our society and of our economy, moving away from fossils, and the social dimension of it is not really addressed. And I think it can be it can be a problem. It can become a problem because, well, there is on the one hand, it can result in a lot of resistance if people do not feel that they are taken on board. It can also result into some problems, for instance, if we are not early on investing into reskilling of the workforce, because there is a different skill set needed in a climate neutral world than currently in a fossil world, and this transformation has to happen. I mean, the biggest obstacle currently in many places for the transition is the lack of skilled workers. So all of these the social aspects, they are not really addressed, and I think that really has to be improved. And on the justice issues, as I said, this basically was kicked out of the climate law at 5 a.m. in the morning, and but now we have parts of it taken in the Aarhus regulation. But yeah, as also Matthias described, there's now a lot of advancement happening, especially on local or at national level with court cases, and I believe that this is also development which will continue and will not be stopped.
Thanks very much. I think that we can perhaps squeeze in one more question and one quick response from perhaps Matthias. There is a question that on whether there's any evidence on climate laws working in differentiated ways in different types of countries, democratic, authoritarian, and so on. So if you can quickly respond to that, and of course, if you have any comments on the just transition, social economic justice question that was also presented.
Yeah. So, well, first to the first question, the short answer is that I'm not aware of analysis that's been done on trying to tackle specifically that question that is looking at why a framework law is framed or coded in a certain way under its respective national circumstances, and whether something works better or works less well. I think it's also important to understand that we're still, except for the work done, for example, by Alina and colleagues on the workings of the UK Climate Change Act, that a lot of these laws have so far been in place only for a small number of years, especially the one with a long-term dimension. Some of the others have been around for longer. So there is very little work yet or research available on how well they actually perform. We can analyze basically what they look like and what's included, but not necessarily do a performance analysis just yet. What is, I think, evident is that indeed no two of these laws are the same. So there is great diversity, despite the fact that also one can see common elements, and these independent scientific councils, for example, really are basically everywhere. But there's great diversity, and so I think there's need and there's scope for that analysis that's implied by the question. And we can see that individual countries are basically picking up bits and pieces from the experience of others and repeating a number of elements, but they're basically all doing this in their own national context and making it fit for their respective settings. And so that's what I can say on that. On the question of the socioeconomic aspects, there is indeed, I think, nothing specific in the EU climate law as such, although a lot of detail on these new mechanisms that have been included, is still to be drawn up. We don't know how will the Commission actually measure whether we have progress towards climate neutrality. How are they going to perform those consistency check on policies? And a just transition dimension, you would think, should be part of a measuring whether we are making progress towards climate neutrality. So I think it could be included there. We otherwise do have, I think the question was asking also whether member states are being held accountable here. There are some minor elements where in the national energy and climate plans, member states should report and include such information. Sometimes this is couched as in like to the extent feasible, for example, on what impacts the policies are expected to have the member states put forward. But in addition to that, we now have this new mechanism, the just transition mechanism at EU level, and there will be territorial just transition plans that member states have to draw up, which are basically, for individual regions, what is the expected transition here that needs to be addressed, and what's the future vision for that territory, and what are the measures that can be realized. So there's a very specific separate process that is trying to address some of those issues. That's not directly linked to the EU climate law, but it is happening in terms of the larger picture of EU climate policy.
Excellent, thank you very much. I'm sure that we could keep on discussing, but unfortunately we already run out of time. So I would want to thank you all participants, and especially our 3 panelists for this very interesting hour and a half. So thank you very much all.